Alright guys, how's it going? By far and away the worst kept secret in April is AMD's release of their new Radeon RX 500 series cards. Launching today, 4 new graphics cards. Only one of them is truly new, that is the RX 550. The RX 580 and RX 570 are based on the older Polaris 10 architecture, that is the RX 480 and the RX 470. With the RX 560 being an upgrade on the RX 460 of last year, and as I said, the new one, the very small RX 550. So what's the point in small upgrades on older cards? Well, 500 million PC gamers are still using graphics cards that are greater than 2 years old, and only 10% of PC gamers upgraded last year, which seems like a very small number, but as enthusiasts, we really are living in our own little enthusiast bubble. There is a vast PC market out there using much older cards and who really could do with an upgrade. We can see here 80% of PC gamers are using graphics cards with lower performance than the R9 380X, and that would be the equivalent of somewhere in between the GTX 960 and the GTX 970 today. So that's a large part of the market using graphics cards that are starting to struggle at 1080p. And according to AMD, 2017 will be incredible for PC gamers. There's going to be 3 times the number of DirectX 12 games, 3 times VR headsets sold, twice the number of FreeSync monitors. That's very interesting because now we're talking over 200 FreeSync monitors and twice the number of game streams and viewers. So based on all that, for the 80% of the market using these old graphics cards, it's time to upgrade. And the new evolved Polaris 500 series is a better reason to upgrade your old GPU. It's got the latest generation FinFETs, higher clock speeds than the 400 series, and also comes with enhanced idle and multi-monitor efficiency. There are also better partner options, one of which I'll be taking a closer look at today. Now moving on to the card specs, these are the reference card specs, and for the RX 580 we have a 1257MHz base clock and a 1340 boost clock, so not a massive increase over last generation's 480, but of course this is the reference. The same 36 compute units and the same 8GB of GDDR5 memory. Looking at the 570, again we see an increase in the base clock to 1168MHz and 1244 on the boost clock, 32 compute units again, and 4GB of GDDR5 memory. You can however get 8GB versions of the RX 570 as well. Now I won't be taking a closer look at the 560 today, but here we can see it now has an 1175MHz base clock and 1275MHz boost clock. 16 compute units, so finally we see the full GPU. If you remember, with the RX 460, AMD chopped off a couple of these compute units down to 14 compute units. So it's good to see we now get the full GPU in the RX 560. AMD should have launched this last year, but they didn't. And again, 4GB of GDDR5. A quick look at some AMD benches shows the RX 560 is well ahead of the GTX 750 Ti. A very, very long way ahead in fact. And with the GTX 750 Ti still selling by the millions, this is a card that everybody in this market segment should be buying instead, so long as the price is right of course. And finally, the newest member of the Polaris family, the RX 550, 1183MHz boost clock, only 8 compute units and 2GB of GDDR5 memory, so this is for sure right at the entry level. We can see it's being compared to the Radeon R7 250 and even Intel's HD 530 graphics, which it is well ahead of course. So this is the market segment for this. I would expect this card to be very, very cheap, and it would need to be. There is of course a massive market here, and the RX 550 will be a huge distance ahead of everything else in this price class. So that's an overview of the new Polaris 500 series cards. So now I'm going to take a closer look at the one I'm reviewing today. And that is the MSI RX 580 Gaming X. There is of course an RX 570 Gaming X, and also an interesting one, a 580 Gaming X Plus, the Plus appearing to be a much larger cooler, so that one's quite interesting as well. I'm just going to be looking at the Gaming X though, and here it is. It's a pretty good looking card. I never really liked the look of it until I actually got the card, but it looks pretty nice in real life. It comes with a back plate, it's got a pretty solid feeling to it, surprisingly so for a card in this price class. Now looking at the connectors, it's basically based on the 480. So you've got your 2 HDMI, your 2 display ports, and your dual link DVI-D. So you shouldn't have any problems plugging this card into any monitor of the past 10 years really. As an aftermarket card, of course it's got an overclock. This one comes with a boost clock of 1395MHz It would have been nice to be 1400, I have to say, but it's not. It's 1395 and also comes with an extra 25 MHz on the memory, up from 2000 to 2025. For the benchmarks today, I've also got the Sapphire 570 Nitro 8GB, which comes with a boost clock of 1340 MHz, also being benchmarked as my MSI RX 480 Gaming X, that's at 1303 MHz, and I'm also throwing in MSI's Gaming X GTX 1070, which comes in at 1974 MHz. And finally, a Palette GTX 1060 at 1874 MHz. The 1070 is of course in a different class, but it will be interesting to see it from a point of reference. So let's move on to the benchmarks. Right, so first up is Ashes of the Singularity GPU benchmark. Crazy settings, and of course I am using the best API for each graphics card. In most cases that means DX11 for the Nvidia cards and DX12 for the AMD cards. 1080p, and I'm using the R5 1600X. Straight up we can see a very large win for the GTX 1070. Nvidia does very well in Ashes of the Singularity. The GTX 1060 actually beats the RX 580, which is only 3.5% faster than the RX 480. Bringing up the rear is the RX 470, but it is pretty close to last year's RX 480. One thing I noticed during the benchmark was that there was some kind of flickering on the GTX 1060. I was going to use the DX12 results because of that, but I let it stand, but it could be something to look out for, as there did appear to be some kind of optimization issue going on there. Next up is Civilization 6, graphics benchmark. Once again, ultra settings and best API. Again, that means DX11 for the Nvidia cards and DX12 for the AMD cards. Very interesting result here. If you remember from my Ryzen 5 review, Civilization 6 ran very well on Ryzen and very poorly on the i5s. But here we can see something very odd indeed, because the GTX 1070 is only 10% ahead of the GTX 1060, which is actually ahead of the RX 580. So there's some kind of optimization issue going on here. Even though Ryzen is much faster than the i5s, clearly the GTX 1070 is still being held back somehow. Again, a small win for the RX 580 over the RX 480, with the RX 470 not being far behind. Looking at all these scores though, there does appear to be some kind of CPU or driver limitation going on here. Next up is some gameplay of Deus Ex. DX11 on Nvidia, DX12 on AMD. This is a game where the GTX 1060 really struggles and is last of all cards. The 1070 is still in the lead, but it's only 20% over the RX 580. Which for the first time in the benchmarks is over 5% ahead of the RX 480. Moving on to some gameplay of Tomb Raider. The 1070 is well ahead again, but the 580 is just fast enough to beat the GTX 1060. So that's quite a satisfying looking chart, with all the cards coming in round about where you might expect. The RX 580 is 6% ahead of the RX 480. And finally we've got some gameplay of The Witcher 3, where as you might expect the GTX 1070 is well ahead again. The RX 580 is almost 10% ahead of the GTX 1060 though, and is once again around about 6% ahead of the RX 480. Looking at the totals, the RX 580 was 4.34% ahead of last year's RX 480. The 580 was also 4.57% ahead of the GTX 1060, but almost all of that lead is down to the Deus Ex result, which if you remove it, both cards are almost exactly tied. The 580 is around 9% faster than the 570, which couldn't quite match last year's 480. Overall though, absolutely no surprises. Now when taking a look at Ashes on the RX 580, I noticed something a little bit strange. The GPU wattage was very high, over 160 watts in most cases, and I also noticed that this meant that it was not able to maintain its maximum clock speed. If you look at the right hand column, we can see that it is no longer able to maintain its 1393 MHz boost clock. This is all because the GPU's power is too high. This in turn increases the temperatures, and we can see that the card is running at 69 degrees, which is actually pretty nice. But nobody wants a throttling graphics card with high power draw. Luckily though, if you watched my Wattman overclocking and undervolting Polaris video, you know that there's a pretty simple remedy for this. So we simply need to go into Crimson Radeon settings and click on the gaming tab. We now click on Global Settings and Global Wattman. Now, over at the GPU, we click on the Frequency tab And here we can see all the boost frequencies on the GPU, with the maximum at 1395. The interesting tab is the one below it, and clicking on voltage control shows the issue. MSI have been very conservative with the voltages here, setting the voltages from state 3 all the way to state 7 as high as 1150 millivolts. Now the RX 480 was a pretty good undervolter, but that was with a 1266 MHz boost clock, so the RX 580 may not undervolt that much. If you remember though, this is a new silicon revision, new FinFETs, which should hopefully allow for better undervolting and overclocking. So I tested it out and found that my card would undervolt all the way down to 1030 millivolts while being able to maintain its 1395 boost clock. In most cases you would simply need to set this final column, but I like to set them all to 1030, at least down as far as state 3. Your mileage is going to vary here. Some cards may even undervolt as low as 1000 millivolts, whereas some may only hit 1100. That's just the silicon lottery, but I would expect that most, around the 1400 boost mark, should go as low as 1050 millivolts. Once you've found your limit, make sure you click on apply. And now we're back in Ashes, we can see that the GPU power draw. Now interestingly, while running Ashes there, the game just crashed. And while looking over my notes, I realised that my true stable voltage was 1040 millivolts, not 1030. I had looked at the wrong column, and that's how you find out your lowest voltage. You just keep dropping the voltage until the game becomes unstable. If the game crashes, or if you see some weird stuff on the screen, it means that your voltages need to be raised in order to maintain whichever clock speeds you want to maintain. So let's get back into Ashes at 1040 millivolts. Now again, we're mostly interested in the wattages, the first column and the final column, which is the megahertz. Instantly we can see the GPU is around 130 to 140 watts, so that's well down on the 160 plus it was at before. At the same time, we can also see at the final column that the graphics card is now able to maintain its maximum boost speed. And on top of that, the card is now only around 63-64 degrees instead of the 69 degrees it was before. Undervolting your graphics card is just a win-win. Able to maintain the boost speed, lower wattages, lower temperatures. And AMD has a really neat technology called Radeon Chill, which can make this even better. I'm going to use World of Warcraft here, and I'm going to set the card back to 1150 millivolts so that we can see the massive differences that undervolting and using Radeon Chill can use. And while I'm in Walkman here, I'm going to switch on Chill. You simply click on the global switch, and you can use this hotkey to switch Chill on or off. Change it to whatever you want or keep F11. Make sure you click on apply. Now those 3 beeps you just heard means that Radeon Chill is running. Right, I found a spot here where the GPU is running around about 145 to 150 watts, and I'm getting just slightly over 200 frames per second. The GPU temperature is 65 degrees and I can hear the fan spinning up. Now all I'm going to do right now is go into Walkman and once again drop down to 1040 millivolts. See what I can do about this 150 watts here. So all set to 1040 millivolts and click on apply. Right, so that has instantly dropped us down around 30 to 35 watts of power. The GPU, which was at around 150, is now running around 120. That's how easy it is to lose 20 to 25% power simply by undervolting. But what if you wanted to drop even more? I mean, do you really need 200 frames per second while playing Warcraft? Especially when you're standing still. Well, this is what Chill is all about. It is really clever software. Chill is basically an algorithm that figures out what you're doing while playing and determines what the frame rate should be based on that. So now I'm just going to press F11 and show you how it works. 120 watts of power, just over 200 frames per second. And we drop down to 60 watts of power, half the power, but the frame rate is down to 1/5 at 40 frames per second. But does it need to be any higher right now? I'm not doing anything, I'm just sort of standing around. If I press the W key on my keyboard, look at the frame rate, jumps to 60 frames per second while you're running forward, which is all you really need so long as you're moving in one direction. Even moving backwards, that's absolutely fine. You cannot really tell the difference between 60 frames per second and 200 frames per second so long as you're moving forward or backwards. It's really only on horizontal and diagonal movement that you really notice the higher frame rate. But we're back at the same spot, once again 40 frames per second, and watch what happens when I just move the mouse. Simply moving the mouse increases the frame rate, and the more you move the mouse, the higher the frame rate gets. This is because the chill algorithm thinks that you're doing something very important on screen, based on how quickly you're moving the mouse. When you think about it, it's really clever, because the faster you move the mouse, the higher the frame rate you want to have, because clearly that's when you most need it. And you can see the corresponding rise in GPU power as well, but it's not that bad. Now the reason it's not that bad is because I have also set a limit at 144 frames per second. Because I'm using a FreeSync monitor, I would never want to go above 144 frames per second anyway. So let's actually create a profile for Warcraft in Radeon Chill and see if we can set this to something even better. Right, so once again, click on the Gaming tab, but instead of clicking Global Settings this time, what you want to do is add a profile. Over at the right hand side, you can either scan for all your games or pick one yourself. I'm going to browse for my World of Warcraft executable, and here it is in my World of Warcraft folder, WoW64. So that has now created a profile in Whatman for World of Warcraft. You can launch the game from here if you want, but I'm going to edit the profile simply by clicking on this. And you get all the same options, but what you want is Profile Whatman. We can see here that the Warcraft profile has inherited the global voltage control and all that. However, you could set it manually here. And here we see something new with Chill. It's got minimum and maximum sliders. Now, you can actually drag it down to 30 frames per second, and a lot of people will be quite happy with 30 frames per second. But for me, I would never want to drop below 60 frames per second at any point, ever. Even when standing still, if something moves across the screen below 60 frames per second, it is clear to me that I am below 60 frames per second. A lot of people will not notice it though. And again, like I said, I never really want to be above 144, because this monitor is a FreeSync monitor with a FreeSync range between 35 and 144 frames per second. So click on Apply now, and let's get Warcraft up and running again. So now the minimum in Chill is 60 frames per second. The power's not that much higher, it's only another 5 or 6 watts. If you remember, it was around about 60 watts at 40 frames per second. That's just how these things work. The further you push a graphics card, the higher you push the frame rate and the voltages, the more out of control it gets. But going from 40 to 60 frames per second is only adding about 5 watts. So really you might as well sit around 60 at a minimum. But the interesting thing here though is when you move around. You can see it actually jumps by quite a lot, up to around 100 frames per second. Right, so I'm back in Whatman again. I've decided to try something out. What I have done is underclocked the RX 580 down to the reference RX 480 speeds, and I've also discovered that I can drop the voltages down to 890 millivolts while remaining stable. I'm going to put the Radeon Chill minimum to 75 frames per second, while keeping 144 maximum, of course. Back into Warcraft for a final time. It's a new day in Warcraft. So here we are, just standing still, 75 frames per second and below 60 watts of power. What a difference that is, from around 150 watts or so of power at a wasteful 200 frames per second. And as soon as you move the mouse, you're well above 100 frames per second. As soon as you turn left and right, up to 120. I mean, these numbers would be even higher if I hadn't set a maximum limit of 144 because of FreeSync. So you can really play around with the algorithm and find what you want. What you think suits you. I've been playing Warcraft like this for months and I do not notice any difference whatsoever in the gameplay experience. It's so fast. The movement is so fast. I literally do not notice anything, and in fact, I would forget all about it if I didn't hear the beeps on startup. So this is definitely well worth checking out. If you're worried about high temperatures, high power usage, I mean, why not play like this and have a completely silent system instead? Because I'm below 60 degrees, the fans aren't even spinning on the MSI RX 580. This is the future of gaming. If not on the desktop, then you can be sure that you're going to see this in laptops before soon, because the power savings are way more important than anything else. And the benefits of Chill are not strictly limited to power savings. Because in some cases, Chill tells the application not to submit a frame, so that means that less frames are being queued. So when the time does come to submit a frame, the input lag is reduced. The frame being displayed is more in tune with the movement on the screen. And this slide shows what I'm talking about. While Chill is on, there are less frames queued, resulting in up to 64% quicker response times, and as we've seen, much lower GPU power as well. It sounds counterintuitive that lower frame rate would increase responsiveness. This is one of those things you should all try out. AMD is adding more games all of the time, and have just added League of Legends and Dota 2, the two most popular games. Slightly annoyingly, it is not enabled for any DX12 games yet. So you're going to have to run DX9 or DX11, which kind of reduces its usefulness, especially in games like Rise of the Tomb Raider, which really do run a lot better in DX12, and the same for Deus Ex. It's completely free though, and as far as I'm concerned, there is almost no reason not to use it, if only for switching off your fans while gaming. That alone is worth an awful lot to somebody like me. Right, so to wrap this one up, the RX 580, RX 570, neither of these cards offer a massive increase in performance over last generation's 480 and 470. So if you've got one of those cards, then you're simply not interested in the 500 series. These cards are really meant for those 500 million PC gamers using the older graphics cards, anything from a GTX 960 and below. The only real competition to the 580 and 570 is the GTX 1060. The 570 is actually in a much lower pricing class and is likely to become the performance per dollar champion, by far in fact. But regarding the 580 and 1060, the big thing here is you cannot get FreeSync on the GTX 1060. Both cards are around the same performance level, but the 1060 requires a very expensive G-Sync monitor in order to get the adaptive sync capability. And simply put, if you're buying a GTX 1060, the chances are that you are not going to be buying a G-Sync monitor. They are simply too expensive. Even people buying GTX 1070s rarely have G-Sync monitors. They are really high-end for the high-end graphics card buyer. And FreeSync is a massive selling point here for the AMD card. Given that the performance is practically identical, I mean sure the 1060 has better power draw, but you've just seen there how easy it is to drop the power usage on these 500 series cards to around about the same level as the GTX 1060, and even below that if using Radeon Chill. You may not have a FreeSync monitor now, but with FreeSync monitors doubling every year, there is a very, very high chance that your next monitor will be a FreeSync monitor. It's getting difficult to avoid them these days. Because G-Sync needs the proprietary module, prices will always remain high. If you really want an Nvidia card instead, you should be starting at a GTX 1070. Anything below that should be all AMD simply because of FreeSync. So to finish this one up, 500 series is simply an evolution of Polaris. You get higher clock speeds. In most cases, underwater you should get 1500 MHz. But with a standard cooler, you should hit at least 1450 MHz. MSI have created an attractive graphics card with a really nice sturdy feel to it, and it also has a nice backplate, and I do like the whole Twin-Frozer 6 cooling system, especially the 0 RPM fans up to 60 degrees, which as you've seen can really work well when used with Radeon Chill. It's a good card, and if you're willing to spend 10 minutes setting it up, it's a great card. Right, so now the 500 series is launched, and the enthusiasts amongst us know that Vega cannot be that far away, so it may well be worth waiting on that. Vega, however, is likely to be in an entirely different pricing class, and Nvidia does not appear to be doing an awful lot in this segment of the market right now either. We may see a refresh of the 1060, but again you're going to be talking 5% more performance and not much else. I hope you enjoyed this review, and I'll catch you later guys.